Daniel Shaw, Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the City University of New York, joins me on the line now. Daniel, welcome. It's a day of mourning, but not for Donald Trump, it seems. The president-elect has commented on Fidel Castro's death. He called him a brutal dictator who oppressed his people for nearly 6 decades. He said that Cuba remains a totalitarian island. What does that suggest to you about the future for US-Cuba relations?
Well, the main forces in power here in the United States would certainly like to return Cuba to its prior pre-revolutionary, pre-1959 colonial status. But the Cuban people who are in mourning today will remain steadfast and will never allow for the re-entry of U.S. capital and the U.S. military to again exploit Cuba.
We saw celebrations in Miami neighborhoods where Cuban immigrants are in big numbers there just after they'd heard about Castro's death. What are they so pleased about?
Well, this doesn't come as any great surprise. These are sections of the Cuban people who were cut off from their wealth and their property prior to 1959. Cuba was a grossly unequal society where you had a small group of land barons who controlled everything, and that's what they want to return Cuba to, so they can dance all they want in Miami, but Cuba's going to hold strong. It's important to remember the quote of Frederick Engels at the graveside of Karl Marx. When we remember Fidel, he was the best hated and he was the most calumniated or the most attacked by the world's oppressors, and the most loved by the world's people, by the humble working people of the world. So we can see Fidel Castro is arguably the most polarizing figure of the 20th century.
The critics say that, yes, he removed an oppressive regime, but that he actually then became an oppressive dictator himself. Do you give any credibility to the people who say these things?
What the critics really mean is that Fidel's true crime was saying that the people of Cuba should be in possession of Cuba's wealth and Cuba's resources. They wanted to turn the clock back on Cuba to the colonial and neo-colonial times. These attacks against Fidel Castro were never personal. They were attacks against Fidel Castro because he personified the anti-imperialist spirit and the dignity of the Cuban people. He was the David who stood up to the U.S. imperialist Goliath. And this was what was unforgivable from their perspective.
Do you think that Castro still provides inspiration for socialists around the world?
Oh, there's no question. We were talking to comrades around the world today as so many tributes poured in. And there's no question that Fidel Castro, more than anybody, represents the oppressed world: Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, poor people around the world. I don't think you can mention any other figure in the 21st or 20th century who's as symbolic and powerful as Fidel Castro. And his legacy continues in Cuba today, in Venezuela, and across the world in the popular anti-imperialist movements that continue to mobilize.
Daniel, pleasure to speak to you. Daniel Shaw is our guest, Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the City University of New York.
Thank you.